students weren't allowed to go into these buildings. But we went in and rescued what we thought the student paper would need to survive in the first couple of weeks of the semester. It wasn't until maybe when we realized how many trailers they were bringing to campus and what was going on that we realized it was going to be a long haul.
Welcome to Matador Memories, a podcast that explores CSUN's history and its impact in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California. I'm Carmen Ramos-Chandler, and today I'm talking to Cynthia Rawitch, who has an endless line of titles: former professor of journalism, former publisher of the Daily Sundial, former interim dean for the Mike Curb College of Arts, Media, and Communication, former associate vice president of undergraduate studies, and former vice provost. But more importantly, today we're talking to Dr. Rawitch about her time at CSUN during the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which at that time was the largest natural disaster to hit a public university in the history of the United States. So, Cynthia, let's talk about what you remember.
One of the questions people ask all the time, where were you? And of course, I was in bed, where most people were. What I remember in that early moments was that as our house planned for earthquake problems had developed over the years, the rule was you meet at the front door. Whoever's in the house, you run to the front door, and we'd meet there. And so my boys ran from one part of the house, and my husband and I ran from the other part of the house and met at the front door. And afterward, my son said, we knew it was really bad because you weren't smiling when you got to the front door. Because most earthquakes, by the time you got from my bedroom to the front door, were over. So we're fine. I wasn't smiling on this one. We could hear the crashing, which was the scariest part, was the noise more than anything else. It is so loud. And I didn't know, of course, but our chimney was coming down. And as it was coming down, it was taking out our roof beams. And our damage was minor compared to, clearly, the university. But to most people had way worse damage than we did. We were fairly lucky. But that was what we remember from the early period of time, the big 40-gallon fish tank crashing over and having dying fish all over the den, those kinds of things. And one of my favorite memories of that was that every glass in our house was broken. There was one last wine glass, crystal wine glass. That was the only thing that didn't break, and we still have that crystal wine glass. Everything else was replaced.
Is it on a mantle somewhere with a little plaque?
Yeah, no, there are plaques on campus, but not in my house.
Now, you were a faculty member at the
was.
time. When did you come onto campus, and what did you see?
I live a mile from campus, so I came onto campus fairly quickly. We drove over fairly quickly to see. We could see the smoke from the burning science building. And by that time, I already knew that the only student on campus in a campus building when it happened was a journalism student who was doing the 5 a.m. KCSN news broadcast in a room without windows. And she told her story later of being in a rolling chair and getting smashed back and forth from wall to wall. And then finally, she ran out, and campus police found her in front of the building and took her to safety. But the first image was the smoke rising, and then as we circled the campus and we saw the collapsed parking structure, that was the part that said, wow, this is way more than we could wrap our minds around, because it was these insanely twisted steel beams that shouldn't have been able to twist that way.
What was your first inclination? What is the first thing you wanted to do?
I wanted to make sure my family was safe. That would be the first one. And then we began to try to talk to other faculty in journalism because, of course, the loyalty was to our department. Whatever was going to happen, we had to be responsible for our faculty, for our staff, for our part-timers, and for our students. And phones weren't working, and cell phones were not. I don't even know if they existed yet, but they certainly weren't common. And so just trying to get to a phone that would ring where you wanted it to ring and somebody would answer was difficult. So we started calling each other to try to figure out, the university is going to have to open. So what do we, that was spring break. winter break. And we knew that we had 2 weeks before classes were supposed to open. And so we said, okay, we'll figure this out. And we started making phone calls. And in with a couple of days, we connected when we knew that people we know hadn't been hurt. So we were fine insofar as that was concerned.
Did you really think the campus would reopen? I know some people thought it wasn't once they saw in the daylight.
They absolutely told us that the campus would reopen. And in fact, there's a picture hanging somewhere in the journalism program. We were told to go into our offices and take out stuff we would need for the next 2 weeks. So 2 weeks after the start of school, so that we would have stuff, lecture notes or whatever for the first couple of weeks. And we all did that. We all had hard hats. We wore tags on our coats. I can't remember why. It was like red tags. Like we were red tagged. I don't quite understand why. And you were allowed to go into office for half an hour, take out what you thought you'd need for the start of school, because we'd all be fine. Now, this is early days. We'd all be fine afterward. There's a picture of two of the journalism professors and me going into the Daily Sundial because students weren't allowed to go into these buildings. But we went in and rescued what we thought the student paper would need to survive in the first couple of weeks of the semester. It wasn't until maybe when we realized how many trailers they were bringing to campus and what was going on that we realized it was going to be a long haul.
I remember I was a reporter at that time, and I did a piece on Dr. Wilson and the recovery of the campus and the reconstruction of the campus. And I remember walking into that Army Corps of Engineer tent, and you were sitting at a typewriter during a meeting. What were you doing, and what was that process of reality in planning for the restart of campus?
The giant tent that was put up, and faculty were asked to volunteer in the tent to answer phones. And I answered the phone, CSUN tent, Professor Rawitch speaking, and because people were calling, there was no communication. The only way they were going to find out is campus opening, what's going on. They would call us in the tent. And all around the tent were pictures, Xerox copies. Somebody had taken the image of the Oviatt Library, the pillars, which was our image on campus in those years, and had cracked them, Xeroxed them, and hung them all around the tent. And so you'd have this picture of the library cracked, as if like an old ancient building, from Greece or Rome. And every time Blenda saw one, President Wilson saw one, she'd tear it down and somebody come by and put it back up, because humor is how anybody gets through these kinds of crises. So in that tent was, what are we going to do? What happens? I was involved pretty extensively in what's happening with the Sundial, what's happening with KCSN radio. One of the radio stations in LA drove a mobile unit onto campus so KCSN could broadcast.
Do you remember which radio station it was?
I don't remember.
Was it KNX?
Could be. I don't remember. And then, of course, the Sundial wanted to publish. This is the biggest story that had ever happened to the campus. And so UCLA printed the Sundial. The students from the campus, within a couple of days, went to UCLA, published a newspaper, and it looks just like the Daily Bruin, because it's their typeface, it's their headline typeface, and so it's CSUN's newspaper, the Daily Sun, but it looks like the Daily Bruin. And I think we did that for a week. Everybody seemed to work relatively flawlessly, given that we're in the middle of chaos. But things happened as they needed to happen. It seemed to me we were up and running as in crisis mode very, very quickly, within a couple of days. And then, of course, up and running literally 4 weeks from the earthquake, we were already on campus. And by that time, Lord help us, 400 and whatever number of trailers were trucked in from everywhere. West of the Mississippi is how it was described. Some of them still smelling of the horses that lived in them before they became CSUN classrooms.
What was the reaction of the students you talked to me? You, because of your position with the Sundial and as a faculty member, you were in touch with students. You weren't an administrator who was up there. What were the students telling you?
Well, the Sundial students were excited. There is that thing about being a journalist, and when a big story happens, you're going to go in the direction of the big story. You're going to worry about the story, not other things. I don't have a sense of any students being frightened. Some students were, maybe all the students were sad because the apartment building across the street had fallen down and a number of people had been killed. And so they had to write about that as well. And so where this was an exciting story, oh, look what happened here, it was also a sad story. I don't remember them being personally frightened, except when an aftershock happened. But so few of us were on campus that until the month later, and then we all still thought it wouldn't take very long. So it'll be like this for a semester. At worst, it'll be like this for a year. If I remember correctly, the last trailer left campus 10 years after the earthquake, and that was the president's trailer.
Do you remember her mandate? You're the one that first told me her order.
The mandate was that everything would be up and repaired. Hers would be the last office that returns to a building.
What was it like to teach in the trailer?
It was interesting. The very first night, I don't remember why I was teaching a night class, because I didn't normally teach night classes. But so there must have been a part-timer who couldn't get here for the class, and they asked me to teach the class. So we go to the trailers, and the trailers were on campus, but they hadn't built the walkways and the stairs yet. And so to get into your trailer you were teaching in, it was like the entrance was about 3 feet off the ground. So you'd sit on the doorway of the trailer, get on your knees, stand up, and that's how you got into your classroom. Campus was pitch dark. That was the other thing I remember. And so you're feeling your way around, but students showed up. Classes went on. There was one professor before this was one of the activist faculty who was always complaining about how much money was spent on administrators. And he said, just give me a tree and I can teach students anywhere. And he had his opportunity to be under a tree and teach students, and that's what he did. But he never complained again about too many administrators.
Do you remember the rains that came?
Yeah, well, it's one of the things that the slogan for the campus that President Wilson had, somebody invented it for her, and it was all over the campus. It was not just back, better. That was the slogan she had created. Well, faculty being faculty and staff being staff, it got twisted. And one of the twists was not better. One of them was not just back wetter. One of them was not just back darker. And the final one that really set everybody off was not better, just back. But in fact, it was a way to deal with, the troubles you had to go through, that you used bathrooms that were in trailers, that you were all on different parts of the campus, that the buildings you're never going into. I found it amazing, and I didn't think about it till years later. There were students who came as freshmen who were never in a real campus building. They came, they took all their classes, they graduated, and had never been in one of the buildings. True of journalism students in large numbers.
Wow. What are your personal memories as a faculty member navigating that semester?
Well, I can remember before they got the trailers up, we held journalism department faculty meetings in my house being the closest to campus of any of the full-time faculty, that the department secretary, Vicki Morton, had the department in her trunk, and that whenever we needed anything, we'd go to her car and open her trunk, and we would find whatever records there were. Students, we tried to make it as normal as we could. We tried to say, there's going to be a sundial, there's going to be a radio station, and that's that's your class. You're in the sundial class or the radio station class. And so that was what we tried to do. There were occasion students who, the sense was, all of this happened and you expect me to do coursework. But I found that very, very rarely the case. Everybody just said, well, this is the way it is. We were on a completely different side of campus. We were on the east side of campus, in trailers almost to Zelza. And that was a completely different world from where we had been, which was almost on the west side of campus. So there are all these little tweaks. You had your lecture notes, and if you didn't, you made them up again. My sense was you looked around campus and even right away, you saw the kind of how quickly everything was being handled. One of my favorite images is the building that used to be called the South Library, which was the original CSUN library. And it was used on the bottom floors. It had a lot of books and resources for education professors, students who are learning to be teachers. And there was a second floor that had something on it. And the third floor is where all of the computers that ran the enrollment system were stored on tapes. And the famous story is the head of the library, the dean of the library, Sue Curzon, was in a cherry picker truck being raised into the third floor window so she could get the tapes so that we could continue registration when one of the big aftershocks happened, scared her. But once they had that and she was out, they shrink wrapped the building. And I think they did that with other buildings on campus too. But the vision I had was like a giant saran wrap that just wrapped it all around the building, because the fear was every aftershock would cause another piece to fall off. And so this way, if you shrink wrapped it, it couldn't fall very far. It could only fall within the confines of the wrapping.
I'm just still thinking of those immediate days. What I came on in June of '94, but what struck me was the sense of community.
Yeah.
I've never experienced anything like that since. And the community that was built during that time, I mean, titles didn't seem to matter. It was, you were Cynthia. You were Jim Lodgen. I didn't know Jim's last name until I don't know how many years. Mike Whiteman. I mean, these were people that you knew. And they were blue shirts, they were groundskeepers, but they didn't make a difference. They knew you by your name because you were cleaning garbage at the same time.
Yeah, and it's funny because one of the questions I thought about is, what did you learn? What did we get from the earthquake? How did it change us? And the note I wrote is a sense of humor and a sense of community, shared purpose, and that helped us through all of that. The catalyst was the earthquake, and it lasted for a fairly long time, but you really do have to have that catalyst. I am not suggesting we should have another earthquake and we'd all become good buddies. That is not my suggestion. But there is something about having kind of this mass crisis on your hands where everybody is, you go to that place and you say, I need help, or let me help you, or is there something we can do to make this better? So it did create a sense of community.
That's it for episode 1 of Matador Memories. We really want to thank you for joining us as we launch the CSUN Conversations podcast network. Tune in to episode 2 as we continue our conversation with Cynthia Rawitch about her time during the 1994 earthquake.